In this episode, we are going to talk about how it is possible to cultivate optimism, grit, and resilience, aspects of the human experience that we often view as fixed traits. To illustrate that these are not static throughout time, I am going to tell you a story about two different periods in my life that seem so different, they sound like they belong to different people. K through 12, achievement was something that felt like it flowed downstream for me. I didn't have to study very hard to get A's in advanced classes. Despite having never played lacrosse before, I was pulled up from JV to varsity over the course of my first season, being able to pull from skills I learned in soccer. Friendship was as simple as walking up to someone new, and thus leadership positions also came pretty easily. As the years went on, I started to face difficulties like anyone, both in and out of the arena of achievement. But I learned that with more effort, you could surmount these odds. For instance, because I didn't have much experience in lacrosse, my skills were not that great, which meant I needed to spend more time on the wall, throwing the ball against the wall repeatedly. Thud, thud, thud. Bless my neighbors for tolerating this, by the way. But with more hours on the wall, my skills improved. But in time, of course, not everything could go my way. I went from my very small pond of 2,000 people in my high school to 53,000 people at the University of Florida. And then from there to an 8 million person pond in New York City. Of course, the odds became more and more difficult. For the first part of these challenges, I remained steadfast in my outlook that with more effort and more time, you can become successful. For instance, I did not get a scholarship to play at a Division I school such as UF, which is extremely competitive. But I had convinced myself that if I had worked harder, or if I'd started sooner, it could have been possible. I believed that with hard work, almost anything was possible. However, this period of my life was also defined by constant pivoting. Around 20 years old is when people are deciding what they want to major in or what they want to potentially do with their lives. So I was trying out a bunch of different things. I've always had an interest in psychology, so I thought maybe I would want to work in research and become a professor. But after doing some research on campus, I realized how painstakingly slow this can happen. I did an internship on Wall Street over the summer between junior and senior year. But the first day of this internship, I knew I would not be taking a job there if I was offered one at the end of the summer. And there was more pivoting ahead. I tried my hand at acting, blogging, performing comedy. I worked in management. I started my own business that failed, and then one that was successful, coaching hundreds, if not 1,000 people in the fitness industry. I published a book and more things that I won't get into because this isn't a CV, it is a story. Coming in the edit, this might sound like I was just casually trying things out while I had a safety net, but I was supporting myself at the time. So there were times in my 20s where I was looking at a negative bank account balance, wondering if any of these risks would pay off. And I wasn't just pivoting because I was bored. I had not yet learned how to stick it out when things got hard. Through these constant pivots, I stopped trusting myself and my optimism faded that with work, you could achieve what you wanted to do. Because first of all, I didn't even know what I wanted to do and I didn't trust myself to follow through or even recognize it when I see it. I stopped believing that I was even a hard worker. I stopped believing that hard work could pay off. Despite what I might tell you if you asked me, I think deep down, I didn't truly hold that belief 100% anymore. While my teens could be summarized by achievement with relative ease, and my 20s by bouncing around when the going got rough, my 30s are what I hope to define by leaning into the slow, plodding effort I once shied away from. Today, we're going to discuss what the field of psychology says about how we can actually grow our grit, resilience, and optimism. Welcome to Immersion, 30 minutes beneath the surface. This is part 3 on a series on positive psychology and the study of happiness. Let's dive in. Someone may wonder what an episode on grit and resilience is even doing in a series on happiness. But it's hard to be happy when we don't believe in ourselves to achieve the things that we want, when we don't feel hopeful about our future, or when we don't have the ability to stick to hard things to make what we want happen in the world. We're going to define these terms, grit, resilience, optimism, and hope, because often people can use some of them interchangeably. If you don't care about the vocabulary or terminology, you can skip ahead a little bit, and I will have where the meat starts linked in the chapter markers below. So resilience is the capacity to withstand or recover quickly from difficulties, per Oxford Dictionary. From the Latin root resilire, or to leap back, and you can picture this like a spring or a ball bouncing back or recoiling back. Grit people often think is synonymous with hard work. But who you can think of as the mother of grit, Angela Duckworth, in her book and on her website, defines it as the following. Grit is passion and perseverance for long-term goals. In her book, she describes it more as endurance in a field or with a given interest rather than about a burst of intensity. For instance, it's not about pulling the all-nighters, it's about staying interested in a certain field for years, which is clearly what was missing in my story before as I was bouncing around different things. Optimism in positive psychology is the general belief that good things will happen or that things will be better in the future in a broad sense. Hope, on the other hand, is more active, as Charles R. Snyder described in Rainbows in the Mind, which, by the way, what a great article name for a research article. He describes hope as the perceived capability to see a path to your goal and believing that you have the agency and motivation to walk it. I personally found this really interesting. Based on the way we use hope in popular culture, I would have thought that hope was sort of the more abstract, less concrete one, but it seems that in the field of positive psychology, it is the reverse. Now, on one level, I wanted to find that things were very straightforward, such as the more optimism one has, the better. And that is largely the case, so of course we will talk about how to grow it, but that's not always the case, so of course we will get to some exceptions closer to the end. The most important place to start, if we were thinking of ourselves as beginning a journey to attain more grit, would be with the idea of the locus of control. Let's do an imaginary scenario. In this world, we're living in a bit of a vacuum, where the only goal you ever tried was to push over a brick wall that no human could truly push down. And there was a person, sort of a boss, telling you to do it, and that this is the only thing you'd be graded upon. And this is how we're judging your capabilities. You might try again and again and again, but after a certain point, you would start to think, understandably, why bother? It would feel quite literally like banging your head against a wall. But because this isn't a vacuum and you don't have any other experience of success or overcoming obstacles, you would start to think that you don't have capabilities for anything, or why bother with other tasks. While this is a pretty one-dimensional example, it does happen in more complex ways in the world with many people and animals. You have likely heard of one of the most famous studies in psychology on learned helplessness. As an animal lover, I don't even like talking about it because it does include the experimenter shocking dogs, but thankfully the field has progressed a lot, and this is not the kind of experiment that would happen in psychology today. This was done in the 1960s. Martin Seligman and Stephen Mayer did an experiment where dogs were put into two different types of cages. In one cage, the dogs would receive a shock, but they were able to get out of the cage by pressing their nose against a panel in front of them. In another type of cage, the dogs were not able to get out. Later, dogs from those two different groups were put into a different type of cage, one that they could easily get out of. When the option came for the dog to get out of the cage, the dogs that were in the experiment before, where they had a way out, easily escaped. However, the dogs that learned that no matter what they do, they could not escape the shock, 2/3 of them laid down and just received the shock, even when there was a simple way out. And this is what is referred to as learned helplessness. The animal learns that no matter what they do, there's no point and they feel helpless. And this unfortunately can translate to many other settings in people's lives. If a dog has been in a cage for long enough, if you've pushed on that metaphorical wall for long enough, if you've been through enough, it's understandable why someone would develop an attitude of why bother when the pain feels inescapable. The problem is, just like those dogs that did have a way out when they didn't see it, there are times in our life when there's ways out that we don't see because we've been in so much pain before. Now, I say we, but of course, some people have been in worse pain than others. And also, it doesn't affect everyone the same way. For instance, 1/3 of those dogs that were in the inescapable box the first time did escape the second box that was escapable. So what researchers, such as Martin Seligman later in his career, or Carol Dweck, who studied growth mindset, wanted to ask is, what helps that 1/3 become resilient of people and of animals? Now, I haven't learned much about the genetic components because there could be an element there. We're studying more what are the things that we can do to become more resilient and to help kids become resilient as we help raise them and help our communities. So how does this relate to the idea of the locus control that we brought up earlier? Locus of Control, developed by Julian Rotter, describes a belief about whether people believe they control their own outcomes or whether they believe that outcomes are determined from external factors. For instance, after losing a soccer game, someone with an internal locus of control might say, "We lost that game because we didn't work well enough together. As a center midfielder, I can work to see the field better. I also want to work on my conditioning because I got really tired in the second half, and we can all improve our ball skills. This is how we'll do that." Someone with an external locus of control could see that situation and say, "The weather was really bad and the refs were not on our side." Now, you might already be able to pick up on the fact, especially if you listened to last week's episode on the psychological immune system, that there could be benefits to either path here. For instance, the person with the external locus of control will have less self-blame. They'll maybe feel less guilty or bad about the situation because, hey, it wasn't their fault. But the person with the internal locus of control will see a path to success. I do think that either one can go too far. I haven't read about this, but I've always had a theory that someone could have an internal locus of control that is too big. For instance, blaming themselves, thinking they could have done better if only they'd worked harder. Kind of like I felt in the past. That led to a lot of self-blame, which actually eroded my self-worth and confidence, even though it might have been coming from a good and empowered place to begin with. This leads to the idea of explanatory styles. This was also work that Martin Seligman contributed to, part of why you can probably already gather he is considered the father of positive psychology, but of course he had other people helping him with this work. Someone with an optimistic explanatory style, which is where people view good things as being internal and permanent, might say something such as, "I closed the sales pitch because I practiced hard, delivered it well, and I'm good at public speaking." So as you can see, they viewed that as having to do with themselves. They saw how they contributed to the positive outcome, and they even had some permanence in that belief. They believe that they're good at public speaking. So that could bolster that self-esteem for future events. But people with an optimistic explanatory style view negative events as specific, external, and fleeting. For instance, "I didn't close the sales pitch because the client wasn't a good fit. It will go better next time." Specific and fleeting, the client was not a good fit. It wasn't personal about the salesperson. And then also fleeting, it will go better next time. This is different than a pessimistic explanatory style for the same events. Someone with a pessimistic explanatory style could not close the sales pitch, and they might think, "I didn't close the sales pitch because I'm terrible and not meant to do this, and my life is a whole mess." So they view that same negative outcome as something that is permanent, something that is personal to them, and pervasive. It even is connected to other things in their life. Now, I don't necessarily think that a purely optimistic or pessimistic explanatory style is the answer to all of this, but if you've been exposed to CBT, like we talked about in the last episode, or just otherwise in your journey into the psychology field, you might already be seeing some ways that we could be questioning those beliefs. Like, are we starting to lump things together now, saying one's life is a whole mess, where we start to sort of spiral? But we'll keep going with the script here. What we should be moving towards, in my opinion, and Angela Duckworth also points towards this in her book Grit, is a growth mindset. This work was thanks to Carol Dweck, who spent much of her working career studying this idea. Here is a quote on growth mindset from a Stanford magazine article. Dweck and her assistants ran an experiment on elementary school students whom school personnel had identified as helpless. These kids fit the definition perfectly. If they came across a few math problems they couldn't solve, for example, they no longer could do problems that they had solved before, and some didn't recover that ability for days. Through a series of exercises, the experimenters trained half the students to chalk up their errors to insufficient effort and encouraged them to keep going. Those students learned to persist in the face of failure and to succeed. The control group showed no improvement at all, continuing to fall apart quickly and to recover slowly. These findings, Dweck says, really support the idea that the attributions were a key ingredient, driving the helplessness and mastery-oriented patterns. Her 1975 article on the topic has become one of the most widely cited in contemporary psychology. It made sense that they had to develop the muscle of adapting, since not everything came easily. This relates back to my story from the beginning. If everything comes too easily, then we never learn how to be resilient when things are so hard that we're unsuccessful. Or as my therapist once told me, everyone gets to a point in life where they hit a wall, where they cannot put in the same amount of effort that they were putting in before and achieve success. Some people might hit this wall at 7, another person at 15, or another person at 25, but we all eventually hit that wall. And I think something that was implied is that if we hit that wall younger, we learn that skill of overcoming obstacles sooner. So as you're probably gathering here, it's important to have obstacles, but not completely insurmountable ones forever. It's about having the right kinds of struggles and learning that we can overcome them. So in my story, while I had learned some hard work, such as pulling all-nighters can help you get a good grade even if you haven't studied much before, or that more hours practicing your sport pays off, I didn't learn that sometimes you fail and that's okay, like other students maybe had learned around 7 or 15. And so conversely, some of those students that had to study harder earlier developed more grit. Growth mindset is something that we can develop though. And this is the belief that different skills, intelligence, all of these things can be improved upon. And with the growth mindset, rejections from jobs, applications from graduate school, difficulties performing in a certain role we're already working in, and even athletic performance in something more playful, such as playing pickleball with our friends, all of these things can be improved. So working on growth mindset as a skill is sort of a meta skill that it can apply to everything else. Now, Angela Duckworth in the book Grit does discuss the fact that just telling someone that it's possible to work harder and achieve things is not enough. The person has to actually experience a setback and then put in some hard work for mastery and realize that they can overcome that setback in order for their brain to change. At least that is how I interpreted it from reading the book, which, by the way, I highly recommend that book, and I'll share some highlights from it at the end of the episode. So up until this point in the episode, we've taken a pretty smooth transition from learned helplessness to the idea of locus of control, growth mindset, seeing how grit loops into this. But we're going to take a quick detour before we get back on that smooth sailing train. I want to give credit to a lot of these researchers and touch on how their work builds on one another. As we can see, the work from Martin Seligman on learned helplessness led directly to Dweck's research on growth mindset, which inspired Angela Duckworth studying grit. And who knows where the field will go from here. I view this as a beautiful staircase with each person's work not standing on its own, but building on the last. This also ties to something I was finding when I pulled out my old positive psychology textbook from school. I was seeing that a lot of it was connected and almost a bit repetitive. For instance, a lot of the research on hope and optimism was really similar to that CBT triangle that we talked about last week, where your feelings affect your thoughts, which affects your behavior, and not only in one direction, but each of these impact each other. For instance, if you don't believe something is possible, you'll think negative thoughts. If you're thinking those thoughts, you won't take any actions, and then you won't have any proof that things can work out for you. So this negative spiral or positive spiral can be self-fulfilling. And this is something that isn't revolutionary, I think, in a conscious way. I think a lot of people would consciously say that they know this, but yet when presented with some of the deepest struggles of our lives, we don't wholeheartedly believe it. It reminds me from this quote from Shrinking, the show about therapists, and Jason Segel's character said in response to someone, "I know that as a therapist, but after seeing people held back for so long," he was alluding to the fact that he just feels like some people will never surmount these walls they're up against, like we've been talking about. I think that at many parts in my own story, I would have, like I said, told you that I believed with hard work anything is possible. Angela Duckworth even said that everyone has someone inside of them with both a fixed mindset and a growth mindset. We're not all the way one way or the other. So I think it's about finding those moments that are extremely difficult where we all start to doubt our ability to grow or improve or to defeat certain odds, where it might take either resharpening these tools or help from the outside. This is where I personally don't think that I could have just picked up a workbook on CBT and changed how I viewed things. I needed a therapist that also did some psychodynamic work, looking into other things in my past, things that we're not getting into here. But we even can look to supportive people in our network. For instance, someone I know who is extremely talented and generally believes in themselves was having a moment of doubt this week and started to doubt not just one part of their creative work, but all of the parts, from this one part being hard. Again, that lumping together aspect we talked about earlier, that P pervasiveness from the explanatory style from earlier. And it took some of her friends, myself and someone else, to pull apart some of these beliefs, one of many being that our worth is not tied to one project. And just to give one tangible action step here before we keep going in a lot of the research and theory, is it can be helpful to visualize negative things happening. For instance, we're often told to visualize the positive. We're told about athletes who visualize success and everything going well in a race. But actually, it's more beneficial to visualize things going wrong. I have heard this in many, many psychology talks where if you're picturing, for instance, a certain goal, like giving a certain speech, to also visualize what would go wrong and how you would overcome it. For instance, let's take that salesperson from earlier, because optimism, for instance, I found in my research, is huge in sales. So imagine that you get ketchup on your shirt before. Imagine you completely blank on certain numbers or figures you should know. Imagine you are late and the client is already annoyed when you get there before the pitch even starts. How will you navigate around these? And then you are not startled. So this is another example why pure optimism 100% of the time is not always the perfect path. It's about how we rise again. In general, though, in psychology, optimism is viewed as a very positive thing. It is tied to better health markers, improved relationships, improved performance at work. So while there are a few exceptions, we will focus on a skill to learn optimism as developed by Martin Seligman. If I just had to guess how this would be developed, my guess would have been through breaking much bigger goals into smaller parts. For instance, I went from that really small pond to the huge pond. So I went from success, that's hard to say fast, to failure. So there was no on-ramp, there was no slightly bigger goals after these smaller goals teaching me that with work, things were possible. That is something that can help, breaking bigger goals down into smaller parts so that we can achieve success instead of being just hit with that wall that's insurmountable suddenly. But Martin Seligman has a model, an ABCDE model, that shows how to reframe our thoughts. So let's use my Wall Street example from earlier. A is adversity. I realized on day one that I didn't want this to be my career and I wouldn't be taking this job. B, belief. I'm a quitter. I'll never find a career that fits. C, consequence. I feel dejected and panicked. I start to have the belief that I quit everything that I start, thinking of the other times I changed careers rapidly, and the story starts to appear that I don't finish what I start. D, disputation. Wait, is this true? I'm not a quitter. I'm a pivoter. I'm looking for alignment. I've succeeded in soccer. I've succeeded in school, and one mismatch doesn't define my future. E, energization. How do I feel after this? I feel the weight lifted. I can finish the summer. I can learn what I can and move on with a new plan from here. Now, I did not do this at the time during the Wall Street internship. I pivoted so much during my 20s that it wasn't even until my very early 30s that I started to realize, wait a second, I was finding my footing. I was experimenting. I was persistent in finding what works for me, and when it felt right, I was able to stick with it. And this shows the power of not just believing a story that is cleanly wrapped up and fed to us by our subconscious, and the power of questioning it. which again, often takes help from the outside. But I think that when we know these tools, we can also apply them ourselves because we don't always have the ability to right then book an appointment with someone or have a friend talk to us. So it's good to have these tools and know how our minds work so that we can also train our own resilience as well. And in the book Grit and in the book Growth Mindset by Carol Dweck, these researchers teach these tools. So I would strongly recommend reading those after this. I've read Grit and now I definitely want to read Growth Mindset as well. So to close out, let's talk about one more shortcoming of being purely optimistic and a few takeaways from the book Grit because I found the book so meaningful. So a time that optimism can be not purely helpful is when things are incredibly difficult. For instance, in Jim Collins' work, the book Good to Great, I'm going to link an excerpt down below and read a little bit of it here. He talked to Admiral James Stockdale, who was the highest person in the military who was a prisoner of war in Vietnam. So he talked about the people that made it home from being a prisoner of war for years and the people that did not make it home. And he surprisingly said the optimists were the ones who didn't make it home. He said, oh, they were the ones who said we'd be out by Christmas, and then Christmas would come and Christmas would go. Then they'd say, we'll be out by Easter, and Easter would come and Easter would go, and then Thanksgiving, and then it would be Christmas again, and they died of a broken heart. Now, I'm pulling out excerpts here from an excerpt from the book. I strongly recommend reading the article. It's pretty brief. I'll link it down below, and it's very powerful. Jim Collins pushes back a bit to understand because it sounded like this admiral had some hope, and yet the people that had the most optimism were the ones that didn't make it out, and he wanted to understand that discrepancy. And then James Stockdale said, this is a very important lesson. You must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you can never afford to lose, with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your current reality, whatever they might be. Yeah, I think we can just sit with that for a minute. Despite the hardest things that I've been through in my life, none of them could come close to anything like that. So it's hard to fully understand. But I think it's a really important point to note that no matter what we're going through, when it's extremely hard, if we think this is going to get better tomorrow, this is going to get better tomorrow, and it's not, that's not helpful. And that could maybe fall under some of that toxic positivity. I don't even really know much of what that is because I've spent more time studying the actual research. But I think that a lot of pop psychology can annoy people because it tries to skip past some of these and tells people they can just think their way out of problems. But it's complicated because with real quality therapy or applying some of the hardier aspects of the research that is more nuanced, we can change our thought patterns. So it's holding these two complicated, nuanced things in our minds that people have maybe faced extremely difficult trauma, but at the same time, things can get better. And an interesting caveat here is that when I went to look this up, the actual research, I saw that the prisoners of war that fared better in the end, 37 years later, it was a longitudinal study, they were the ones that had more optimism. So somewhere deep down, they must have believed that things would get better, that life was worth living. And that's what we're talking about finding and cultivating here. And I'm going to link everything below. I know I've said that about a lot of things, but you can definitely do further reading. Now let's close with some takeaways from the book Grit. I truly do recommend reading it because I'm only going to be able to pull a few of them out here. And this is the kind of book that I even think you could read multiple times at different points in your life and learn different things or relearn them when we forget them in hard moments. So one main takeaway that Angela Duckworth discusses is being relentless with your long-term aim or your higher order goals, but being flexible in your more short-term or lower-order goals. So let's take the example of someone that I greatly admire, Diana Nyad. Her goal was to swim from Cuba to Florida. Now, she might have even had other higher goals, such as to inspire other people that they can achieve really difficult things like this, but let's take that as her higher order goal for simplicity here. And underneath that, she would have lower order goals, such as swimming a certain number of laps on a certain day, or tracking the weather with her team to decide when to go. And each of these could even be broken down into lower order goals than that, such as waking up at a certain time to start swimming her laps. If we look at this goal pyramid, we can be flexible with the smaller goals, but we cannot be flexible with the bigger goals. So for instance, if the weather didn't allow her to go on a certain day, that didn't mean that she abandoned her higher order goal of swimming from Cuba to Florida. It meant that she abandoned that trip that day. And here's a quote that I love from the book that helps to paint how we can approach some of these lower order goals and still give them a lot of significance because we see how they tie to our higher order goals. And this can be so inspiring. So this is Angela Duckworth talking to and about Tom Seaver, who many believe is one of the best pitchers of all times. During his 20-year professional baseball career, Seaver aimed to pitch, quote, the best I possibly can day after day, year after year, quote. Here is how that intention gave meaning and structure to all of his lower order goals. Pitching determines what I eat, when I go to bed, what I do when I'm awake. It determines how I spend my life when I'm not pitching. If that means I have to come to Florida and can't get tanned because I might get a burn that would keep me from throwing for a few days, then that means I never go shirtless in the sun. If it means I have to remind myself to pet dogs with my left hand or throw logs on the fire with my left hand, then I do that. If it means in the winter that I eat cottage cheese instead of chocolate chip cookies in order to keep my weight down, then I eat cottage cheese. The life Seaver described sounds grim, but that's not how Seaver saw things. Quote, pitching is what makes me happy. I've devoted my life to it, and I've made up my mind that it's what I want to do. I'm happy when I pitch well, so I only do things that help me be happy. And this ties to what we talked about in part 1 of this series on eudaimonic happiness versus hedonic happiness. Hedonic happiness would have been eating the chocolate chip cookies. Eudaimonic happiness has to do with meaning. And because he finds so much meaning in his purpose and work, then this whole life as a whole gave him a sense of satisfaction and happiness that comes from a different place, and it encapsulates our whole being. And this ties back to Diana Nyad because I remember in her TED Talk, I saw this over 10 years ago, and she said, I want a goal so big that it determines how I live every other aspect of my life. And I personally think that this can bring a lot of people satisfaction. However, I'd love to hear from you in the comments if you agree with this or not. It doesn't mean that you can't care about other aspects of your life or your people or your relationships, but how do you relate to the idea of purpose and these higher order goals dictating lower order goals and how that relates to happiness? We're about to close out here. Just try to close a few other open tabs in my mind. So finally, grit is a better predictor of success in extreme challenges like West Point's Beast Barracks than IQ, but it isn't the only factor. In today's world, we shifted from seeing the individual as being purely responsible for their success or failures to learning to see systems as a whole and how a child's school or their parents or other factors determine their success, not just their inherent talent. And grit is tied to that because she goes into the book talking about parenting and school systems. But I even think that someone without reading the book could view this as the idea of having to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And I think grit taken out of context can just sound like work harder, and that can tie back to that self-blame we had earlier. So as a society, I do think we're getting better at seeing the whole system. But I think that also studying grit is about learning to play the cards that were dealt effectively. We can't help the cards we're dealt, but we can learn to play them more effectively. And so that ties back to part 1 as well, with the different percentages of what makes up happiness. And whether 20% or 40%, we can learn to utilize the percent that we can control. I think for people that were brought up being told that they should either find a passion for what they love and love what they do, or they were told to love and enjoy the process and find authentic motivation in it, the days where things are really difficult can feel like maybe you're not on the right path and maybe it's time to pivot. And as a prior pivoter, what I get some inspiration from is hearing stories from people that stuck it out even when so much of the path was actually pretty miserable, but the path itself still felt worth it. Here's a final quote from the book. This was from Angela Duckworth talking to Rowdy Gaines, who was an Olympic gold medalist. He said that he swam the equivalent of swimming around the world for what ended up being only a 49-second race. And she asked, "So did you love practicing?" And he said, "I'm not going to lie. I never really enjoyed going to practice, and I certainly didn't enjoy it while I was there. In fact, there were brief moments walking to the pool at 4 or 4:30 in the morning or something when I couldn't take the pain, when I'd think, God, is this worth it? So why didn't you quit?" she asked. "It's very simple," Rowdy said. "It's because I love swimming. I had a passion for competing, for the results of training, and for the feeling of being in shape, for winning, for traveling, for meeting friends. I hated practice, but I had an overall passion for swimming." This helped remind me that not every bit of advice we get is good. I think that a lot of millennials were told that we should love what we do. And Cal Newport's book, for instance, Be So Good They Can't Ignore You, really questions the idea of passion. And grit even questions the idea because it's the idea of staying in a field for a long time where you can get mastery in that field. And so, for instance, on the days where I don't feel like showing up to script for this podcast for 5 hours straight or diving into the research for 20 to 30 hours leading up to a certain episode, when the puzzle pieces don't fit together, when I feel lonely, when there aren't many downloads, when the community that I want around these ideas where we can all talk to each other about different things we're reading and what I visualize hopefully happening down the line, when it's not happening, I just remember the parts that I do like. And I remember that these things take time. And I remember that no matter what path I'm on, it would be difficult. So which one am I willing to suffer for? And that's something that many thinkers and philosophers have spoken on. That's not exactly new, but this is more of a psychological approach to that idea. And I found what he said interesting. He said he loved the result of his practice because we're often told that we shouldn't care about the destination. But I think a lot of these paragons of grit really do care about mastering the piano and becoming successful at it, or mastering their art, being a cartoonist. For instance, the example she told about the cartoonist who had 2,000 rejections from the New Yorker before eventually working there. I think they do care about actually getting tangibly better. And there's a way to enjoy the process while also hating parts of it. And there's a way to care about the results without obsessing over the short-term version because you know in the long term you care ultimately about that aim. And that's a lot of what I want to focus on, is being able to hold these two things in our mind. How do we care a lot about its success, but not obsessing over it to the point that we're unhappy? You will only work hard if you think that it will eventually pay off. And you will only think that it will pay off if you learn that when there are setbacks, you can adapt around them. This is taught not only through achievement, but by hitting roadblocks and learning to master a new skill or grow an attribute that is a way around those roadblocks. So we hold in our hands the delicate balance of wanting something, but not wanting it so much that we can still get our long-term aim, even if the short-term aims don't work out. And for some of this, learning to hold something with the right level of attachment could be learned in Buddhism, but we need to stop here. And I want to thank you so much for being here for this journey. Thank you to Boris for the edits and Miranda for producing the show. And next week, we will speak about how physical health impacts our mental health in part 4 in our happiness series. If you found this helpful or interesting, consider sharing it with a friend and having a conversation about it this week. You all can maybe help each other develop more grit. Speak with you next week.